The forces of chaos are once again rising, and with them comes a brand new army book and a host of brand new miniatures. Among these ranks are the Chosen, the blessed few within the hordes of chaos-worshipping warriors who bear the favour of their dark masters. Their old metal models are being replaced with a brand new plastic kit, giving me the perfect opportunity to forge them into the image of the Changer of Ways. I took the Chosen from the Slave to Darkness army set, which was provided for me by Games Workshop, and began to remove the parts to build a model from the sprue. Once removed, the mold lines and sprue tabs were shaved away before finally gluing the torso and legs together, creating the starting point of this Kitbash. The first change was a straightforward weapon swap. The huge Executioner-style axe would be transformed into a Tzeentch-inspired glaive-like weapon by using the sword from a Carrick Acolyte. The replacement began by first removing the axe head from the handle using clippers, making sure to angle their flat side towards the hand. In a similar way, the Carrick Acolyte sword was also removed from the hand, making sure to preserve as much of the blade as possible. With both pieces removed, the end of the handle and the base of the sword could both be filed and shaved flat. Regular viewers of the channel will have already guessed what is next, and that is of course pinning. This involves drilling a 1mm hole into the dead center of the handle and then into the base of the sword. Into the hole, some 1mm steel wire was superglued. Once dried, the wire was cut down so just a few millimeters were left poking out. This wire was then superglued into the hole within the axe handle, locking the glaive's blade in place and providing a much sturdier bond. With the glaive completed, both it and the arms were attached to the torso. I wanted to give the armor the appearance of being demonically possessed. For a warrior devoted to Tzeentch, it made sense that his armor would be empowered by infernal means, and to represent this, I grabbed some parts of a blue horror. Taking some inspiration from the Curseling miniature, this blue horror would be placed directly against the right shoulder. But this wasn't until the little clipping and trimming had been performed to remove the leg and to allow it to conform to the contours of the shoulder. Once it was sitting well, the blue horror was glued into place. The set of arms that matched up to the blue horror's torso were also taken from the kit before being clipped in half. The left arm from this pair was then trimmed up and glued into place against the blue horror's torso, creating the appearance of the demon erupting out from the armor. The effect needed a little blending though, as it was still looking very tacked on, but I wouldn't tackle this just yet. Before any adjustments were made to the head, the small tab was first removed from its neck. By shaving this protrusion back, it created a ball joint that would give me more freedom when positioning the head against the neck. The helmet I'd selected already had a good set of chaos horns, but this could be pushed further and allow a little extra Tzeentchian flair to be included. The Zangor kit comes with a few extra horns that can easily be added to the Chaos Chosen. All that was needed was to separate and cut down the length of the horns with some clippers. From here, the base of the horns, as well as the intended location on the helmet, could both be trimmed back and flattened out with a knife. After making a few comparisons to ensure everything was lining up, the horns were glued into place. With the head complete, it was attached to the torso in addition to the right shoulder pad. Bird motifs are a big factor when it comes to Tzeentch. Both their greater demons and mortal followers demonstrate a feathery style. As such, this is a great way of giving your own models that Tzeentchy aesthetic. There are a lot of kits out there that feature wings and feathers that could easily be used, but this particular part was taken from the Carrick Acolytes. The first adjustment was to clip away the wingtip so that it could fit behind the Chosen's right shoulder. It was still looking a little big, so several trims and comparisons were made with both clippers and the knife until the wing could fit beneath the shoulder pad. It was then glued into place to create the appearance of a feathered half cloak. When looking to represent the arcane knowledge aspect of Tzeentch, books and scrolls are a great option. This particular scroll was sourced from the Flagellant kit, but there are lots of sets out there that contain various scrolls and books that you could use. There were a few spots around the waist that could house this scroll, but I decided to glue this just beneath the right arm. The only thing left to do at this stage was to blend that blue horror into the Chosen's armor, and this would be done with some green stuff. The putty was cut and mixed together before being laid down across the boundary between the demon and the armor. With a few of these lumps in place, I began the process of smoothing out and blending the two surfaces together. This task was achieved with a combination of metal and rubber-tipped sculpting tools, but in both cases, Vaseline was used. Small amounts on your tools will help to prevent the putty from sticking and also result in a smoother finish. So long as you don't slather it on, you shouldn't have any problems with applying paint later on, but you can wipe away any excess once it's cured. After blending and creating the appearance of stretched flesh, the model was complete and ready to be painted. But before we go on with the painting, let's hear a little bit about this video's sponsors, Broken Anvil Miniatures. Fans of Broken Anvil know them for their beautifully sculpted minis and fresh designs. And now they've got a brand new web store with a wonderful selection of some of their most beloved models. They've got Sir Tornavir, they've got Izzy Gribble the Gnome Wizard, and if you like orcs, BAM has several to choose from. Also, check out their monthly special release, A Turkey Paladin. Broken Anvil also has a new campaign live right now called Forged, which is an enormous collection of fantastically sculpted 28mm heroic scale, pre-assembled plastic miniatures, together with 5th edition compatible content. You can choose between the Heroes box, the Enemy Encounters box, or get both with the Adventure box. As this campaign grows, so can your haul. Dozens of free and purchasable extras are waiting to be unlocked and added to your collection. If you want a massive assortment of BAM's amazing miniatures without breaking the bank, then backing their Forge campaign is your chance. Links to Broken Anvil's website and Forge campaign are in the video's description below. The painting began with the application of a black primer which was applied through my airbrush. This created a unified colour across the model, whilst allowing the later layers of paint to get a better hold onto the surfaces. For this miniature, I decided to use some contrast paints in order to get a bright and vibrant scheme. But contrast needs to be laid down over a light base coat, and black is quite the opposite. To remedy this, I did some pre-shading by lightly spraying a little Tamiya XF2 over the top of the primer. The airbrush was angled from above so that the white paint built up on the upper surfaces rather than the deep recesses, which remained as the black primer. Now if you don't have an airbrush, feel free to just prime your model white instead. You can still follow the rest of the guide with no issues. This step just helps to create some fake shadows in the recesses, giving the model a bit more volume. To give the model that iconic bright blue colour of Tzeentch, I began with the contrast paint Frostheart. This was applied straight from the pot, but I didn't apply too much at any one time. The trick when working with contrast is to focus on one panel at a time. This helps reduce the likelihood of surface staining and tide marks as you're not applying more contrast over already dried contrast. The paint was applied across all of the armour. Combined with a white base coat, the result was a really rich and vibrant blue. But as this paint was applied, a lot of care was taken to avoid overspilling onto the non-armour areas. It's important to keep these as untouched as possible, as you'll be able to see any overspill when you apply your other contrast paints over them. The next paint was Doomfire Magenta. Straight from the pot, this particular paint is incredibly rich though, and I wanted something a little paler. So to reduce the intensity, some contrast medium was mixed into it in a roughly 50-50 mix. Once that intensity had been subdued a little, the mix was painted across the blue horror that had been bonded to the shoulder, effectively turning it into a mini pink horror. In addition to the horror, this mixture was also applied across the feathered cloak on the back. For the remaining base colours, the same principles as that first layer of Frostheart were followed. This saw me painting the leather boots and pouches with some Garagak Sewer. The horns, teeth and the scroll were all given a coat of skeleton horde to achieve that bone and worn parchment effect. To paint the cloth visible in the gaps in the armour, the incredibly dark Black Legion was used. Volupus Pink was painted across a number of areas, including the loincloth, the protruding tongue of the horror and the wrappings around the weapon. This particular shade is similar to Doomfire Magenta, but a little darker and less vibrant. Still, it contrasted nicely against the bright blue of the armour. The final contrast base coat was Striking Scorpion Green, and this was painted across the twisting flame being held within the horror's hand, resulting in a bright, magical green fire. The final few base coats were to the metallic areas, which meant that I had to switch over to the Pro Acryl range, specifically Rich Gold. This was applied across all of that armor trim, which is quite a lot on these Chosen. As this was a regular paint, a little water was mixed in and 2 layers were applied in order to achieve a smoother, more consistent finish. Similarly, some dark silver was then applied across the steel areas of the model, completing the base coats. With the metallics finish, my paint water was also changed out to prevent those metal flakes getting into my other paints. While the earlier highlight layer of white had created a decent amount of depth in the model by darkening down the recesses, this could be pushed further with some washes. This step is also particularly helpful if you selected a white primer to start off with. The first wash that was selected was Citadel's Tyrant Blue, and this was applied across the armor. Here the wash flowed into the recesses, helping to further darken down the shadows already created by the black primer and the contrast paints themselves. Carroburg Crimson was then applied to both the Doomfire Magenta and Volupus Pink areas. Finally, Reichlin Flesh Shade was painted across the areas of gold. This not only helped to bring out some of the recesses, but also created the appearance of a warmer gold, which contrasts nicely against the cooler blue in the armor. With the recesses darkened down even further, the next area of focus were the edges and raised details. By lightening these areas, it would allow them to stand out even further against the darker shadows, furthering that depth of detail. These highlights were created by mixing some of Vallejo's pale sand into the original contrast paint, creating a lighter version of the contrast paint that could be used as a highlight. For each of these contrast paints, 2 highlight mixtures were created, with one having a little more pale sand than the first, and therefore being lighter. Once mixed, the darker of the 2 paints was carefully applied along the hard edges and details, creating thin lines of lighter paint. With the first highlight complete, the second highlight was focused onto the more prominent edges. By limiting it to only the most defined details, or where 2 edges met to create a point, this light mix can be used to add a degree of sharpness to certain details. This process of mixing contrast paint into some pale sand to create 2 highlights was continued, first with some Doomfire Magenta, which was used to highlight the pink horror and the feathers. Next was a Garagak Sewer. Like with the base coat, these highlights were used to tackle the leather boots and pouches. For the bone and parchment, things were approached a little differently. The first highlight was created, as usual, by mixing together Skeleton Horde and Pale Sand, but the second highlight involved just using Pale Sand on its own. Skeleton Horde isn't too dark, so doing this just allowed for a greater degree of sharpness in those final highlights. From there, the process was resumed with 2 highlights of Black Legion and Vallejo Pale Sand. The dark pink cloth areas were then given a couple of highlights of Volupus Pink and Pale Sand. But before proceeding with the green, a few areas were painted with Pale Sand. This included the eyes of both the Chosen and the Horror, as well as the engraved runes on the armor. This base coat allowed me to apply a little more striking Scorpion Green in order to create the effect of glowing infernal magics. From here, the highlights could be resumed by taking some more striking Scorpion Green and mixing up those 2 highlights. These were then applied to both the flames and the eyes. The final highlights were made over the metallics, and once again, more Pro-Acryl paint was used. Bright gold was used to highlight the, unsurprisingly, gold areas, before finishing off the painting with a highlight of silver over the edges of the steel areas. And with that, all that was needed to do was to make a simple base and give everything a matte varnish, which left me with this. And so that concludes this guide on how to paint a Tzeentch marked Chosen. Now in this particular model, I applied several different modifications, but these can easily be spread across a whole unit, reducing both the time and the financial cost required to give your units a little Tzeentchian flair. If you enjoyed this guide and would like to see me tackle more Chosen of different gods, then let me know in the comments below, along with any other kit bashes you'd like to see me try in the future. Now before I go, let me say a big thank you to the ever wonderful patrons who keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters, who are Jack Ewan, Jonathan Hart, Tim, Brushlicker Nim, Daniel Dowling, Jesse Smith, Joachim Falk, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Swedsman, and the Googles. If you're interested in supporting me too, you can find a link to my Patreon below, where supporters can get ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Plus, you'll be helping me out in the process. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.